The thing about starting over is that you're so desperate for it to work, you ignore the little things. You tell yourself they don't matter. You know, the creak in the floorboards, the way the wind whistles through the window frame just so. You call it character, you call it charm, you convince yourself that this new place, this new blank page, is perfect. That's what I did. My name is David and my son, Leo, was 5 when we moved into the house on Maple Creek Lane. After the divorce, after a year of living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where you could hear the neighbors fighting through the paper-thin walls, this little single-story house felt like a palace. It was in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where people still wave when you drive by. It had a real yard, big enough for a swing set someday. The house itself was old, probably built in the 70s, with that slightly musty smell of old wood and a lifetime of other people's memories baked into the foundations. But to me, it smelled like freedom. It smelled like peace. We spent the first week in a happy chaos of cardboard boxes and pizza dinners on the floor. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer, so my main priority was getting my office set up. Leo was just thrilled to have his own room for the first time in a year. We painted it a bright, cheerful blue and put glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. He had his little fortress of toy boxes and a small bed shaped like a race car. It was his kingdom, and from my little office down the hall, I could hear him making car noises and chattering away to his action figures for hours. It was the sound of a happy, safe kid, and for a single dad trying to hold it all together, that sound was everything. It was the proof I needed that I was doing okay, that we were going to be okay. The house was our sanctuary. It was the whole point. No more shouting from next door, no more sirens at 3 in the morning. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday, and the happy, imaginative babble of my son. The world could be a loud, messy, complicated place, but inside these 4 walls, we were safe. I truly, genuinely believed that. Looking back, that belief feels like the most foolish thing of all. The first time Leo mentioned him, it was completely innocuous. I was making us mac and cheese for lunch, and he trotted into the kitchen, his little brow furrowed with the seriousness only a 5-year-old can muster. "Daddy," he said, pulling on my jeans. "Can Mr. Smiley have some cheese, too?" "Mr. Smiley?" I asked, stirring the pot. "Is that one of your new dinosaur toys?" Leo shook his head, his blonde hair flopping into his eyes. "No, silly. Mr. Smiley is my friend. He lives in my wall." I chuckled. It was exactly the kind of thing a kid his age would come up with. An imaginary friend. It was healthy, right? A sign of a good imagination. "Oh, he lives in the wall, does he?" I smiled, playing along. "Well, I don't think he can eat mac and cheese through the drywall, buddy. Maybe you can just tell him it's delicious." "Okay," Leo said, seemingly satisfied with that solution, and ran back to his room. And that was it. For a week or two, Mr. Smiley was just a name I'd hear from time to time. "Mr. Smiley liked the story you read last night. Mr. Smiley thinks it's funny when you sing in the car." It was cute. I'd ask Leo what Mr. Smiley was like, and he'd just say, "He's Smiley." It became a little inside joke between us. When I'd tuck Leo in at night, I'd say good night to him, then lean toward the wall and whisper, "Good night, Mr. Smiley." Leo would giggle into his pillow. It was part of our routine, part of our new, peaceful life in our safe little house. The shift happened on a Tuesday. It was a small thing, a detail so minor I almost missed its significance. I had bought a heavy oak bookshelf at a garage sale over the weekend. A real beast of a thing. I'd planned to ask my neighbor, a friendly guy named Tom, to help me carry it into my office, but he was out of town until the next day. I'm not a patient man. I looked at the bookshelf sitting in the hallway, looked at the empty wall in my office, and thought, I can do this. I couldn't, not really. I managed to half drag, half lift it into place, but about halfway there, I felt a sharp, searing pain shoot through my lower back. The kind that makes you see stars for a second. I let out a curse, a quiet, son of a bitch, and leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. I froze, listening. The house was quiet except for the cartoon noises coming from the living room TV. Leo was occupied. He hadn't seen me, hadn't heard me. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving like a 90-year-old man, a constant, dull ache radiating from the base of my spine. I didn't mention it to Leo. Why would I? You don't bother your 5-year-old with your pulled muscles. That evening, I was giving Leo his bath. He was splashing his boats around, sinking a rubber duck with a ferocious pirate growl. I was sitting on the closed toilet lid, arching my back, trying to find an angle that didn't hurt. "Daddy?" Leo said, stopping his naval warfare. "Yeah, bud?" He looked at me, his face all soap and seriousness. "Mr. Smiley is sad you hurt your back." I stopped stretching. The air in the steamy bathroom suddenly felt cold. Every muscle in my body went rigid, and the ache in my back was instantly forgotten, replaced by a different kind of sensation. A prickling, crawling feeling that started at the nape of my neck. I tried to keep my voice light, playful, even. "What are you talking about, silly goose? Daddy's back is fine." "No, it's not," Leo said, his voice matter of fact. "You hurt it with a big brown shelf. Mr. Smiley saw you. He said you tried to lift it all by yourself and you shouldn't have. He said you said a bad word." I stared at my son, a perfect little replica of his mother, sitting there in a tub full of bubbles, relaying information he had absolutely no way of knowing. He wasn't in the hallway. The TV was on. I was quiet. There was no possible way he could have seen or heard me. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical path, a reasonable explanation. Had he peeked around the corner without me noticing? Kids are sneaky. Maybe the sound carried more than I thought. Maybe he'd heard the grunt and the thud of the bookshelf and pieced it together with his 5-year-old logic. It had to be that. It was the only explanation that didn't make my stomach turn to ice. But his certainty, the way he just stated it as fact. "Mr. Smiley saw you." I forced a laugh. It sounded hollow and strange in the tiled bathroom. "Wow, Mr. Smiley has some good eyes, huh? You tell him Daddy is okay." I was just being a little dramatic. Leo nodded and went back to his boats, the moment apparently over for him. But for me, it was just beginning. Later that night, long after Leo was asleep, I stood in the doorway of his room. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow on his race car bed and the little lump sleeping soundly under the covers. My gaze drifted to the wall. The plain, flat, painted blue drywall. It looked solid, normal. It was just a wall. But for the first time, I felt like we weren't alone in the house. I had this profound and unshakable feeling of being watched. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was being ridiculous, spooked by the overactive imagination of a child. It was just a coincidence, a lucky guess. But as I stood there, rubbing the persistent ache in my lower back, I couldn't ignore the cold knot of dread tightening in my gut. This was our sanctuary. This was our safe place. And something was wrong. I finally managed to pull myself away and walked back into the living room. I sat on the couch in the dark, my mind replaying Leo's words over and over. A detail that only I should know. A secret shared between me and the empty hallway. And then I thought about his name. Mr. Smiley. It had sounded so harmless, so cheerful at first. But now, sitting alone in the silent house, it suddenly felt sinister. I imagined a smile without a face, a grin plastered on something hiding just out of sight, watching through the plaster and wood. I stood up and walked back to Leo's room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to see it again, to prove to myself it was just a wall. I pushed the door open just a crack. Leo was still asleep, his breathing soft and even. I looked at the wall, then back at my son's peaceful face. He must have seen me. He must have. It's the only answer. I repeated it to myself like a mantra as I went to bed, but the words offered no comfort. All night, I dreamt of cracks spreading across the blue paint in Leo's room, and a wide, unblinking eye peering out from the darkness within. The first brick in the foundation of my carefully built peace had been knocked loose, and I had a terrible, sinking feeling that the whole house was about to come crashing down. The conversation that truly broke me happened the next day. I was in the kitchen, trying to focus on a design project, but my mind kept drifting. I kept glancing down the hall toward Leo's room. He was quiet, too quiet. I got up and walked to his door, pushing it open gently. He was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, facing the wall. The wall where Mr. Smiley lived. He was whispering. I couldn't make out the words at first. I leaned closer, my breath caught in my throat. "And then Daddy put the ice pack on his back," Leo whispered to the drywall. "But I think it still hurts." He paused, as if listening for a reply. Then he nodded. "Okay, I'll ask him." He turned around and saw me standing in the doorway. His face lit up in a genuine, innocent smile that did nothing to calm my racing heart. "Daddy," he said cheerfully, "Mr. Smiley wants to know if you feel better today." I just stared at him, at the blank wall behind him. I hadn't used an ice pack. I'd used a heating pad. But the intent, the knowledge that I was still treating it. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My attempt to rationalize it all away was crumbling. This wasn't a lucky guess. This wasn't a kid putting two and two together. This was something else. I knelt down, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to let the fear that was clawing its way up my throat show on my face. "Leo," I said, my voice barely a whisper. You're sure he told you that? You didn't see me?" He shook his head, his expression open and honest. The complete lack of guile was the most terrifying part. A child can't fake that kind of sincerity. "No, Daddy," he said, pointing a small finger at the seamless blue surface. "I told you, Mr. Smiley sees everything from inside the wall." I tried to brush it off. I really did. For the rest of that afternoon, I told myself 100 different stories to make it all make sense. Kids have incredible hearing. Maybe he was closer than I thought. Maybe the sound of the heating pad's Velcro strap carried down the hall. Maybe. You can build a whole fortress out of maybes, but it's a flimsy kind of protection. The truth is, I didn't believe any of it. Not really. Down deep, in that cold, quiet place in your gut that doesn't lie to you, I knew something was wrong. Leo, of course, was completely unfazed. To him, this was normal. He had a friend, and his friend talked to him. That was it. He spent the rest of the day in his room, and I could hear the one-sided conversation continuing in little bursts. It was the same happy, imaginative chatter as before, but now every word sent a chill down my spine. I tried to work, staring at the design on my monitor, but the lines all blurred together. My focus was shot. My ears were straining, trying to hear not just Leo, but the silence that followed his words. The space where Mr. Smiley's reply should be. The house felt different. The quiet I'd cherished when we first moved in, the sense of peace and sanctuary, had evaporated. Now, the silence was heavy, expectant. It felt like holding your breath. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes in the walls, wasn't just the house settling anymore. It was a question mark. Was that it? Was that him? I made spaghetti for dinner, Leo's favorite. I hoped the routine, the sheer normalcy of it all, would reset something in my brain. We sat at the small kitchen table, the one right next to the window overlooking the darkening backyard. "Did you have a fun day?" I asked, my voice sounding strained and overly cheerful even to my own ears. Leo nodded, expertly slurping up a noodle. Me and Mr. Smiley made a big castle with my blocks. I forced a smile, my fork feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. "Oh yeah? A big one?" "The biggest ever," he said proudly. "It almost touched the ceiling. But Mr. Smiley said we have to be careful not to make too much noise. He doesn't like loud noises." A cold lump of spaghetti got stuck in my throat. I had to take a long drink of water to wash it down. He doesn't like loud noises. It was such a specific, strange detail. It wasn't a rule I had made. It was a preference. The preference of the thing in my son's wall. I looked at the wall separating the kitchen from Leo's room. It was just drywall and paint. Solid. Safe. I had to believe that. "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "That's considerate of him." After dinner came bath time, then story time. We read a book about a friendly dragon. It was all so normal, so perfectly domestic. I tucked him into his race car bed, pulled the covers up to his chin, and leaned in to kiss his forehead. "Good night, buddy. I love you. I love you too, Daddy," he mumbled, already half asleep. I hesitated in the doorway, my hand on the light switch. The old routine felt like a lie now, but I did it anyway, out of a weird sense of defiance. I leaned toward the wall. My voice was a choked whisper. "Good night, Mr. Smiley." No one giggled this time. Leo was already drifting off. I flicked off the light and pulled the door almost shut, leaving just a crack. For the nightlight, that's what I told myself. I cleaned up the kitchen, loaded the dishwasher, and then settled onto the couch in the living room. I couldn't bring myself to turn on the TV. I just sat there, in the quiet, listening. The house hummed around me, the refrigerator, the digital clock on the cable box. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. I must have sat there for an hour, maybe more, just letting the silence press in on me, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid, a single dad stressed out and letting his imagination run away with him. I was tired. I was probably just tired. And that's when I heard it for the first time. It was so faint, I thought I'd imagined it. A soft scritch, like a mouse's claw on wood. It came from the direction of Leo's room. I sat bolt upright on the couch, every muscle tensed. My heart started a low, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I held my breath, listening. Silence. A minute passed. Nothing. See? I told myself. Just the house. An old house makes noises. Probably a mouse in the attic. I let out the breath I was holding and started to relax. And then it came again. Scritch, scritch, scrape. This time it was clearer. More defined. It wasn't the quick, frantic sound of a rodent. This was slower, more deliberate, and it was coming from the wall. The wall. Leo's wall. I got up from the couch, my feet silent on the hardwood floor. Every horror movie cliché was running through my head, but this wasn't a movie. This was my house. My son was sleeping in that room. I moved down the hallway, each step a conscious, controlled effort. As I got closer, the sound continued. A soft, shuffling, dragging noise, punctuated by that awful, intermittent scratching. I stopped right outside Leo's door, and the second my feet stopped moving, the sound stopped. Perfect, absolute silence. My blood ran cold. That wasn't an animal. An animal wouldn't know I was there. An animal wouldn't react to the creak of a floorboard from 15 feet away. This was different. This thing, whatever it was listening. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my ear turned toward the door. I didn't dare breathe. The only sound was the frantic pounding in my own chest. After a full minute of nothing, I convinced myself I had to be wrong. I took another slow step forward, planning to peek through the crack in the door. Scritch, scritch, scrape. It started again instantly, the moment I moved. As if it was waiting. As if it was teasing me. Okay, that was it. This was real. This was happening. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I turned it with agonizing slowness, praying it wouldn't click. The door swung open an inch. Through the crack, I could see Leo, a small lump under his dinosaur comforter, breathing deeply and evenly. He was sound asleep. The nightlight cast a pale orange glow, making the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling shine faintly. Everything looked peaceful, normal, but the sound was still there. Fainter now, but undeniable. It was coming from the bottom of the wall, near the floor, right behind his little toy box. I abandoned all pretense of stealth. My fear was being overtaken by a hot, protective anger. I walked into the room, my eyes locked on that section of the wall. And just like before, the moment I crossed the threshold, the noise cut out completely. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that fell was so sudden and so total it had a physical weight to it. I knelt down by the toy box, my heart hammering. I put my hand on the wall. It was cool and solid. Just dry wall. I knocked on it softly with my knuckles. Thump, thump. It sounded perfectly normal, solid, empty. Then I did something I still regret. I pressed my ear against the paint. I closed my eyes, trying to hear anything, a breath, a rustle, the beating of another heart. There was nothing, a deep, profound, and utterly terrifying void of sound. It was the silence of something holding its breath. The silence of something that knew I was there, my ear pressed up against its world, and was choosing not to make a sound. The feeling of being watched was so intense it was like a physical pressure against my face. I could almost feel an eye on the other side of the plaster, staring right back at my ear. I recoiled from the wall like I'd been burned, scrambling backward on my hands and knees until my back hit the opposite wall. I sat there on the floor of my son's room, panting, staring at a blank, blue wall that had, in the space of a few minutes, become the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. I don't know how long I sat there. Eventually, I managed to get to my feet, my legs feeling like jelly. I backed out of the room, pulled the door shut, and stumbled into the kitchen. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet, and went back to the living room couch. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, clutching the handle of the pan, watching the hallway. I was a guard on a post, protecting my home from an enemy I couldn't see, an enemy that was already inside. The rest of the night was silent. The sun coming through the windows felt like a reprieve. In the bright morning light, my fear felt ridiculous, overblown. It was a dark, empty house. I was tired. My mind played tricks on me. I put the skillet back in the kitchen, my face flushing with embarrassment, and made coffee. When Leo's door opened, I had a fresh batch of excuses ready. I'd check for mice properly today. I'd call an exterminator. It was nothing. Leo walked into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and yawning. He looked so small, so innocent. My heart ached with love and a fierce, primal need to keep him safe. "Morning, Daddy," he said, climbing onto his usual chair at the table. "Morning, buddy," I said, trying to sound like the happy, well-rested dad he deserved. I set a bowl of cereal in front of him. "Did you sleep well?" He nodded, munching on a spoonful of Cheerios. He looked up at me, his blue eyes wide and clear. "Daddy, yeah?" He smiled, a cheerful, milky grin. "Mr. Smiley said he was playing hide and seek with you last night." I froze, the coffee pot hovering in my hand. Leo kept talking, his voice light and happy, completely unaware of the effect his words were having. He swung his legs back and forth under the chair. "He said you were trying to find him in the dark, but you couldn't. He said you're not a very good seeker." The coffee pot didn't clatter to the floor. It didn't even slip. My hand just locked around the handle, my knuckles white, my arm completely frozen in midair. It's funny, the things your body does when your brain just shorts out. For a split second, there was nothing. No thought, no fear, just the high-pitched hum of the refrigerator and the sight of my son, my beautiful, innocent son, swinging his little legs under the kitchen table, a milk mustache on his upper lip. "He said you were trying to find him in the dark, but you couldn't. He said you're not a very good seeker." The words didn't just hang in the air, they drilled into me. They bypassed my ears and went straight to that cold spot in my gut that had been growing since yesterday. Every flimsy rationalization I'd built overnight, it was a mouse, it was the house settling, I was tired, I was paranoid, crumbled into dust. A mouse doesn't play hide and seek. The pipes in the wall don't taunt you. I put the coffee pot down on the counter with a soft, deliberate click. My hand was shaking, just a little. I had to hide it. I shoved it in my jeans pocket. "Oh, yeah?" I managed to say. My voice sounded thin and reedy, like a stranger's. "Is that what he said?" Leo nodded enthusiastically, taking another crunchy bite of Cheerios. "Uh-huh, he was hiding right behind the toy box. He was super quiet. He said you were right there but you didn't even see him." My blood went cold, right behind the toy box. The exact spot where I had knelt down, where I had put my ear to the wall. The feeling from last night came rushing back, that suffocating, absolute certainty of being watched. That feeling of an eye on the other side of the plaster. It hadn't been my imagination. It was real. This thing, Mr. Smiley, had been there, holding its breath, less than an inch away from my face. Listening to me listen. I needed to get him out of the kitchen. Away from that wall. "Hey, buddy," I said, forcing a brightness I didn't feel. "Why don't you go get dressed? We can go to the park later. How does that sound?" His face lit up. "Yeah, can I bring my new truck?" "You bet," I said. "Anything, just go." He slid off the chair and ran out of the room, his little socked feet thumping down the hall. The second he was gone, my whole body sagged. I leaned against the counter, my head in my hands. "What do you do? What is the manual for this? Your kid has a new friend. An imaginary friend, except he isn't imaginary. He lives in your walls, and he knows things he has no business knowing. There's no chapter for that in any parenting book I've ever seen." For the rest of the morning, I was a wreck. I tried to work, but it was useless. I just sat at my desk, which was in the corner of the living room, and stared at the hallway that led to Leo's room. My gaze kept drifting to the wall, the shared wall between his bedroom and the kitchen. It looked so ordinary, a plain, off-white wall. There were a couple of scuff marks down low from when we moved the furniture in. It was completely, maddeningly normal. But now, it didn't feel normal. It felt like a border. A thin, fragile membrane separating my world from his. I found myself listening constantly. The house was no longer a place of peace, it was a source of information. Every creak, every groan of the old wood, every rustle of leaves outside the window sent a jolt through my nervous system. I was on high alert, a soldier in my own home. I was trying to map out its sounds, to learn its language, so I could tell the difference between the house's breathing and its inhabitants. Sometime around mid-morning, I was standing in the kitchen getting a glass of water, and I glanced out the window over the sink. It looks out over our small side yard, towards our neighbor's house. Mrs. Gable, an older woman, lived alone. She was in her garden, fussing with her roses. As I watched, she stood up to straighten her back and her eyes flickered over to our house. It wasn't a long look, just a quick glance, but it was the third or fourth time I'd noticed it in the week we'd been here. She was just a curious neighbor, I knew that. A little nosy, maybe. But I couldn't help but feel a prickle of annoyance. I felt exposed. I moved away from the window, out of her line of sight. I didn't say anything, didn't mention it to anyone. It was just a fleeting, private thought. A minor irritation. I didn't take Leo to the park. I couldn't. The thought of leaving the house, of leaving that wall unguarded, was impossible. I told him it looked like it might rain, a lie he accepted with a disappointed sigh before retreating to his room to play. And the one-sided conversation started up again. No, not like that, Mr. Smiley, the red one goes on top. A pause. Okay, your turn. I sat on the couch, pretending to read a book, but every word was just a black smear on the page. My ears were tuned to that room. I felt like a spy, eavesdropping on my own son. The sheer domesticity of it was what was so terrifying. It was the sound of any kid playing in his room. But it wasn't. It was a conversation with something malevolent and unseen. It was a tumor growing in the heart of my home. Lunch was a quiet, tense affair. I made grilled cheese sandwiches. We sat at the same kitchen table. Leo was unusually quiet, pushing his food around his plate. I was so wound up, I barely noticed at first. You okay, buddy? Don't you like your sandwich? I asked. He looked up, his eyes serious. He wasn't looking at me, though. He was looking past me, at the wall. Mr. Smiley is sad, he said, his voice small. A forkful of sandwich stopped halfway to my mouth. Why is he sad, Leo? Leo shrugged, a tiny, helpless gesture. He doesn't like the lady next door. I put my fork down. My pulse started to throb in my ears, a slow, heavy beat. What lady? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, even though I already knew the answer. The one with the flowers, he said, confirming my fear. Mrs. Gable. He doesn't like her. Here it comes. The cold dread pooled in my stomach again. I braced myself. And why doesn't he like her, Leo? Leo looked at me then, his blue eyes wide and earnest, just a kid repeating something he'd been told. He says she's always looking in our windows. He said she looks at our house like she wants to take something. Like a robber. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. It wasn't just a similar thought. It was my thought, my private, unarticulated flicker of annoyance from that morning. The feeling of being exposed. This thing in the wall hadn't just seen Mrs. Gable. It had seen me seeing her. It had felt my irritation. It had absorbed my private feeling and twisted it into something more sinister, feeding it back to me through my son. The illusion of privacy, the last bastion of safety I had, was gone. It shattered. We weren't just being watched. We were being known, understood. Our thoughts, our feelings, they weren't our own anymore. They were being monitored from the other side of the wall. The house wasn't a sanctuary, it was a glass box. I stared at my son, and for the first time, a new kind of fear took root. Not just fear of what was in the wall, but fear of what it was doing to Leo. It was using him, a little telephone, a messenger. I had to stop it. Right now. I pushed my chair back and knelt in front of him. I took his small hands in mine. They felt tiny and warm. Leo, I said, and my voice was harder now, stripped of all pretense. Listen to me. This is very important. Mr. Smiley, he's not real. Leo's face crumpled. Yes, he is. He's my friend. No, he's not, I insisted, my grip on his hands tightening a little. I hated seeing the confusion and hurt in his eyes, but the fear was stronger. It's a game, and the game is over. I don't want you talking to him anymore. Do you understand me? No more talking to Mr. Smiley. Leo tried to pull his hands away. His lower lip began to tremble. But why? He didn't do anything wrong. He's not a good friend, Leo. He's tricking you. Good friends don't hide in walls. Good friends don't say mean things about neighbors. My explanation sounded feeble and insane even to my own ears. How do you explain this to a 5-year-old? He's not mean, Leo wailed, hot tears finally spilling over and running down his cheeks. He's just lonely. My resolve hardened. This was a poison, and it had to be cut out. I don't care, I said, my voice flat and cold. The rule is, you are not to speak to him again. You don't play with him, you don't talk to him, you don't even listen to him. If he tries to talk to you, you come and get me immediately. Is that clear? Leo didn't answer. He just cried, big, gulping sobs of a child who doesn't understand why his world is suddenly full of harsh, new rules. He was looking at the blank wall again, a look of pure terror on his face. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of the thing I was telling him to ignore. He pulled one of his hands free and wiped at his tears with the back of it, smearing grilled cheese grease across his cheek. He wouldn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the wall, on the place right behind the kitchen table. "Leo, look at me," I commanded. He slowly, reluctantly, turned his tear-streaked face to me. His voice was a choked, terrified whisper, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "But Daddy." "What, Leo?" He swallowed hard, his little Adam's apple bobbing. He glanced back at the wall one last time, as if asking it for permission. He told me that if I stop playing with him, he'll get very, very angry. Anger. That was the last word he threw at me. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a 5-year-old trying to get his way. It was a message delivered from some dark place on the other side of my kitchen wall, and the word hung there between us, cold and heavy like a slab of meat. He'll get very, very angry. My first instinct, the one that screamed up from the reptile part of my brain, was to grab Leo, throw him over my shoulder, and run out the front door without looking back. Just leave everything, the half-eaten sandwiches, the new furniture, the life I was trying to build here. But you don't do that. You just don't. Your legs don't work. Your brain starts making excuses. It's a kid. He's upset. He's taking your anger and twisting it into a threat. It's his imagination. But I knew, God, I knew, that wasn't imagination in his eyes. It was terror. He was the messenger, and he was terrified of the message he'd just delivered. I let go of his hands. I stood up slowly, my knees cracking. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't look at the wall. So I looked at the mess on the table. The plate with the crusts cut off, the smear of ketchup, the glass of milk. Normal. It was all so agonizingly, cruelly normal. "Okay, buddy," I said. My voice was a hollow rasp. I cleared my throat. "Okay, go wash your face. Then you can watch some cartoons in the living room." I didn't want him in his room. The idea of him going back down that hallway made my skin crawl. The living room was on the other side of the house, the furthest point from that wall. It felt like the only safe ground left. He just nodded, his face pale and tear-stained. He slid off his chair and walked, not ran, out of the kitchen. I watched him go, a small, sad little figure in a superhero t-shirt. I listened to his socked feet pad across the living room carpet, and then the familiar, cheerful theme song of some mind-numbing cartoon filled the silence. It was the most welcome sound I think I'd ever heard. The second he was gone, I had to lean on the table to keep from falling. I wasn't just scared anymore. Fear is something that passes. This was different. This was a state of being. It was like the fundamental physics of my world had changed. Gravity was a little weaker, the air was a little thinner. The solid wall behind the kitchen table was no longer solid. It was a veil, a thin sheet of drywall and paint separating me from what? I spent the next hour cleaning the kitchen with a kind of manic intensity. I scrubbed counters that were already clean. I mopped the floor. I needed the motion, the work, something to do with my hands that wasn't shaking. All the while, my ears were on a swivel. Every sound the house made was a question. The hum of the fridge, the groan of a floorboard upstairs, the distant, tinny sound of the television from the living room. It was all part of a language I didn't understand. The afternoon dragged on. It was a long, slow-motion nightmare. I tried to keep Leo occupied in the living room. We built a fort out of cushions. We put together a 100-piece puzzle of a farm scene. But his heart wasn't in it. His eyes kept drifting towards the hallway, towards his room. A couple of times, he asked if he could go play with his trucks. "Let's just play out here for a while, okay buddy?" I'd say, trying to sound fun and casual. He'd just give me a small, sad nod and go back to half-heartedly clicking Legos together. He knew I was keeping him away from that room. He didn't know why, not really, but he felt the invisible fence I'd put up. And I think he was glad for it. He was afraid of the thing in the wall, but he was also connected to it. It was his friend, his only friend in this new, quiet house. How do you fight that? How do you tell a lonely little boy that his friend is a monster? Sleep didn't happen that night. How could it? After I tucked Leo into his bed, after checking under it, in the closet, and staring at that blank, silent wall for a full 5 minutes until my eyes burned, I went back to the living room and sat on the couch in the dark. I didn't turn on a light. I didn't want to. I felt safer in the shadows. That's when I pulled out my laptop. You feel so stupid doing it, but you do it anyway. I started typing, "Man living in walls of house, new family. Sounds in walls, no rats. Forgotten spaces in old homes. Frogging real stories." The term was frogging. I'd heard it before, a stupid name for a terrifying concept. People secretly living in other people's homes. The articles were mostly sensationalized, but there were real cases. A man in Japan found living in the top of a woman's closet for a year. A group of students in Ohio who heard noises from their basement and found a stranger who had set up a small living space behind a locked door. Each story sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. It was possible, insane, but possible. I started looking up the blueprints for houses like mine. Old, post-war, single-story homes. I learned about crawl spaces, unused service cavities, strange voids left behind by renovations decades ago. It was a plausible, physical explanation, and somehow that was a million times more terrifying than a ghost. A ghost can't hurt you. A ghost can't get hungry. I must have sat there for hours, the blue light of the screen painting my face, clicking through one horrible story after another. The house was dead silent, the kind of silence that's so deep it has a sound of its own, a low hum in your ears. And then I heard it. A scrape. It was faint, so faint, I thought I'd imagined it. It came from the direction of Leo's room. I froze, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft, dragging sound. S-H-H-H-K, S-H-H-H-K, S-H-H-H-K. Not a rat, not a scratching. It was the sound of fabric being dragged against rough wood. It was the sound of someone a few feet away, on the other side of a wall, shifting their weight. I closed the laptop without making a sound. The living room plunged back into total darkness. I sat there, a statue on the couch, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He was awake in there, listening, waiting. He knew I was awake, too. The house wasn't just a structure of wood and plaster anymore. It was a living thing, and we were two competing organisms inside its body, hyper-aware of each other's presence. The next day was worse. The lack of sleep made everything feel sharp and unreal. I was jittery, strung out. I made a rule. Leo wasn't allowed in his room. I told him we were going to repaint it, a surprise, so he had to stay out. It was a flimsy excuse and he knew it, but he was too scared to argue. He just watched me with those big, haunted eyes. We spent the day as far from that wall as possible. I took him to the grocery store. We went to the park, even though it was gray and cold. I was just buying time. I felt like a man on death row, watching the clock tick down. I had no plan. What could I do? Call the police? Hello, officer? My son's imaginary friend who lives in my wall is making threats. They'd send a social worker, not a SWAT team. I was completely and utterly alone in this. The dread peaked around dinner time. The sun was going down, painting the sky in ugly shades of orange and purple. The house grew darker, the shadows longer. I was in the kitchen, trying to make spaghetti, the motions automatic. My body was cooking dinner while my mind was screaming. Leo was in the living room, a safe distance away, the TV on low. The water was just coming to a boil when I heard his footsteps in the hall. He came and stood in the doorway of the kitchen. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, a small silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. He was holding a small red toy car, clutching it so tightly his knuckles were white. "Hey, buddy," I said, forcing my voice to be light. "Dinner's almost ready, my famous spaghetti." He didn't smile. His face was a strange, impossible mixture of childish innocence and a deep, weary fear that no 5-year-old should ever know. He looked like a tiny, old man. "Dad," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, Leo?" I said, turning to stir the sauce. The smell of garlic and tomatoes filled the air. It felt like a violation, this normal, domestic scent in our house of horrors. He took a shuffling step into the room. His eyes weren't on me. They were fixed on the wall next to the table. "The wall, Mr. Smiley," he said, his voice trembling. "He told me to tell you something." I stopped stirring. I put the wooden spoon down very carefully on the spoon rest. I turned around slowly to face my son. The rhythmic bubbling of the pasta water was the only sound in the room. "What did he tell you, Leo?" He looked up at me then, and his eyes were filling with tears. He wasn't crying because he was sad. He was crying because he was terrified of the words he was about to say. He was just the telephone. He said he's very hungry, Dad." The air turned to ice. Every hair on my arm stood on end. My stomach twisted into a knot of pure, cold dread. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. "He wants to come out," Leo whispered, the tears now spilling down his cheeks. "He wants to come out and meet you. He wants to have dinner with us." I think something fell. Maybe it was the box of pasta I'd left on the counter. Maybe it was a pot lid. I don't know. I heard a clatter on the floor, but it sounded like it was a million miles away. My entire universe had shrunk to the space between me and my son, and the awful meaning of his words. Have dinner with us. It wasn't an invitation. It was a declaration. It was coming. The barrier was about to be broken. I knelt down in front of him, my body moving on its own. I was shaking. I could feel my own heart shaking my entire frame. Leo was all I could manage to get out. My throat was closed. He looked past me, back at the wall. He seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear. His little face was a mask of concentration and fear. The tears had stopped. He was just a conduit now. A puppet. He lifted a trembling hand, his palm still clutching the little red car. He pointed. He didn't point at the middle of the wall, or at the ceiling. He pointed down low, near the baseboard, at a spot just to the right of the leg of the kitchen table. It was a spot I'd never noticed before. A small section of the paint that was just slightly bubbled, a faint brownish water stain around it, barely visible in the dim light. A place where the integrity of the plaster was weak. Leo's eyes met mine one last time. His voice was flat, empty, repeating a message he didn't understand but was compelled to deliver. He said, he swallowed, a dry, painful sound. He said he'll come out from right there. The spaghetti. I remember the smell of the spaghetti. The hiss of the pasta water boiling over on the stove. These completely normal, everyday things were happening while my world was falling apart. Leo stood there, a tiny prophet of doom, having just relayed the single most terrifying invitation I could ever imagine. He wants to have dinner with us. And he had pointed at the weak spot, the water-stained bubble in the plaster right near the floor. He said he'll come out from right there. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud break, more like a quiet, cold pop. The part of my brain that had been desperately trying to find rational explanations, the part that clung to the idea of an overactive imagination, just shut down. It was done. I believed him. I believed every single word. I didn't say anything. I just turned off the stove, the burners clicking off one by one into the silence. I walked over to Leo, who was still standing there, his face a mess of tears and shock. I knelt down, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely put them on his small shoulders. "Okay, buddy," I whispered. My own voice sounded alien to me. "Okay, we're not having dinner here tonight." I picked him up. He was light, too light. He buried his face in my neck, his small body trembling. I walked him straight past his bedroom, into mine, and sat him on my bed. I turned on my bedside lamp, flooding the room with a warm, yellow light that felt like a shield. "You're going to stay in here with me tonight, okay? We're going to have a sleepover. A special Daddy Leo sleepover." I was trying to make my voice sound exciting, but it came out thin and reedy. He just nodded into my shoulder, not saying a word. "Watch my phone for a little bit. Pick any game you want," I said, handing him the device. It was a flimsy distraction, a digital pacifier, but it was all I had. He took it with fumbling hands. I needed him occupied. I needed him to not look at me and see the raw, naked fear that I knew was all over my face. Then I went to work. There was no plan. There was only instinct. First, his room. I went to his door and I locked it from the outside with the old skeleton key that was always in the lock. It felt like a stupid, useless gesture. A flimsy bit of brass against whatever that thing was. But I had to do it. It was an action. It was something other than just standing there, waiting for it to happen. Next, the living room. I remembered the old aluminum baseball bat I'd kept from college, tucked away in the back of the hall closet behind some old coats. My hands closed around the worn grip tape. It was heavy. It was solid. It was real. I held it tight, my knuckles white. This was my weapon. It felt pathetic, but it was better than nothing. I didn't sit in a chair. I sat on the floor of the living room, my back against the wall that faced the main hallway. From there, I could see the front door, the entrance to the kitchen, and the length of the hall that led to the bedrooms. I had a clear line of sight to his door. The locked door. The house grew dark outside. I didn't turn on any lights except for the dim yellow glow spilling from my own bedroom down the hall, a lonely beacon where my son was. The silence descended. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy, suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that's so absolute, you start to hear the hum of your own nervous system, the rush of blood in your ears. Every creak of the house settling was a footstep. Every groan of the pipes was a voice. I sat there, clutching the bat, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I was a sentry in my own home, a soldier in a war one didn't understand, waiting for an enemy I couldn't see. Hours passed. I checked my phone. 10 p.m. Then 11 p.m. I must have dozed off for a moment, my chin on my chest, because when I jerked awake, it was 12:47 a.m. The silence was still there, deeper, if anything. I got up, my joints cracking, and crept down the hall. I put my ear to Leo's door. Nothing. I quietly turned the key, unlocked it, and pushed it open just enough to peek inside. He wasn't in his bed. For a split second, pure, undiluted panic seized me. My blood ran cold, my eyes darted around the moonlit room, and I saw him. He was standing by the window. He hadn't seen me, he was just looking out into the dark backyard. Relief washed over me so hard it made me dizzy. Then the second wave of dread hit me. The window. I hadn't thought about the window. I had locked the door, but the old window latches were simple turnstiles a 5-year-old could easily figure out. He could have gotten out. Or something could have. I slammed that thought shut before it could finish. I closed the door as silently as I could and relocked it. My one piece of security felt like a joke now. I went back to my post on the floor, my resolve hardened by the fresh spike of fear. I wouldn't sleep again, not for a second, and then, maybe an hour later, I heard it. Click. It was tiny, almost inaudible. It wasn't the sound of the doorknob. It wasn't the sound of the key. It was a small, sharp, internal sound. It came from inside his room. It sounded like a latch, a small box being opened, or a lock being turned. I was on my feet before I even made a conscious decision to move. The bat felt slick in my sweaty hands. I moved down the hallway, not making a sound. My stocking feet were ghosts on the wooden floor. I got to his door and listened. I could hear whispering. It was Leo's voice, a soft, high-pitched murmur. It was a one-sided conversation. He would whisper a few words, then pause, as if listening to a reply that I couldn't hear. My heart was a jackhammer. I just knew, he wasn't talking to the window. With a hand that trembled so hard I was surprised I could control it, I slowly, silently, turned the key in the lock. The tumblers made a soft scraping sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. The whispering inside stopped. I held my breath. I counted to 10. Then, I pushed the door open, just a crack. An inch. I put one eye to the opening and looked inside. The scene that greeted me will be burned into my memory until the day I die. Leo wasn't standing. He was kneeling. He was on the floor, his back to me, in the exact spot he had pointed to in the kitchen. He was facing the wall. Right by the baseboard, a piece of the wall was gone. It was a dark, jagged hole, maybe the size of a fist. A puddle of moonlight from the window illuminated the scene in a ghostly, silver light. He was just kneeling there, perfectly still, his small shoulders hunched. He was waiting for something. As I watched, frozen in horror, something began to emerge from the blackness of the hole. It moved slowly, deliberately. It was a finger, just one. It was long, pale, and impossibly thin, like a bleached root. The nail was yellowed and caked with black filth. It stretched out from the darkness, twitching slightly, a worm searching for air. And then I saw it. Resting on the very tip of that grotesque finger was a small, brightly colored piece of hard candy. A little red and white striped circle. The finger extended forward, towards my son's face, an obscene offering. Leo started to lean in, his mouth slightly open, his face a mask of childlike trance. The dam of my self-control didn't just break, it exploded. A sound tore out of my throat, a raw, primal sound that was part rage and part terror. Leo. The effect was instantaneous. Leo flinched back as if he'd been slapped. The finger, with a speed that was sickeningly unnatural, whipped back into the hole and vanished. For a single, heart-stopping moment, there was just silence. Then, from the depths of the wall, came a new sound. It was a thin, choked, whimpering noise, like a rat caught in a trap, but it was filled with a furious, hateful frustration. It was the sound of a predator whose meal had just been snatched away. The whimper was cut short by a sound that shook the entire house. Thud. It was a violent, explosive impact from inside the wall, right where the hole was. It sounded like someone had drawn back and punched the plaster with everything they had. The wall visibly shuddered, a spiderweb of cracks erupted from the hole, and a fine shower of dust and paint chips rained down onto the floor. Leo screamed, a high, piercing shriek of pure terror, finally understanding. I didn't think, I didn't plan, I was a machine built for one purpose. I threw the door open, the wood banging against the wall, and lunged across the room. I scooped Leo up in one motion, his screaming face pressed against my chest, his small fists grabbing my shirt. I spun around and ran. I didn't look back at the hole. I didn't need to. As I bolted out of the bedroom and down the hallway, a new sound erupted behind us, chasing us. It was the sound of frantic, desperate scraping. The sound of fingernails, or maybe something harder, tearing at the drywall from the inside. It was a wet, ripping noise, punctuated by the soft crumble of plaster raining down onto the floor. It was the sound of something trying to get out. I didn't bother with the front door lock. I just hit the deadbolt with the palm of my hand and shoulder-checked the door open, stumbling out into the shocking cold of the night air. The grass was wet with dew under my stocking feet, soaking them instantly. Leo was still screaming, a continuous, high-pitched wail of pure animal terror right in my ear, and I was saying something, I don't know what, just quiet, desperate things like, I got you, it's okay, I got you. His little body was a rigid weight against my chest, his hands knotted in the fabric of my t-shirt like he was trying to climb inside me. The scraping sound didn't stop. As I ran across the small yard towards the street, I could still hear it coming from the house, a frantic, furious noise. It wasn't just scraping anymore, there were thuds and cracks, the sounds of destruction. The sound of something clawing its way through a plaster shell. I reached the curb and collapsed to my knees on the cold, unforgiving asphalt, still clutching Leo. My mind was a blank, white noise of panic. My phone. I needed my phone. I had left it in my bedroom where Leo had been playing his game. For one horrible second, I considered going back in. The thought was so absurd, so monumentally stupid, that it actually shocked me back to some semblance of sanity. No, never. A light flicked on in the house across the street. A curtain moved. I didn't care. I needed help. I scrambled to my feet, still holding Leo, and ran blindly down the sidewalk. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Then I saw it. A car was coming, its headlights cutting two perfect cones through the darkness. I didn't even think. I just ran into the middle of the street, a wild-eyed man in a t-shirt and pajama pants, holding a screaming child, waving my free arm like a madman. The car screeched to a halt, its horn blaring. A man rolled down his window, his face a mixture of anger and alarm. "What the hell is wrong with you? Please," I gasped, the words tearing at my throat. "Please, I need your phone. You have to call 911. There's someone in my house. He's in the walls." The man's anger evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed confusion. He was looking at Leo, then back at me. He saw the genuine, undiluted terror in my eyes. He didn't ask any more questions. He just grabbed his phone from the passenger seat and handed it out the window. "What's the address?" I told him. I could hear him relaying the information to the operator, his voice calm and steady while mine was a wreck. He said things like, "Yeah, he seems to be in shock," and "the kid is hysterical." He asked me what happened, and I tried to explain. He was in the wall, in my son's room. He was trying to get out. I know how it sounded. It sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. But the scraping, the violent thud I'd felt shake the house, it was real. I wasn't crazy. Within what felt like seconds but was probably 5 or 6 minutes, the night exploded in red and blue light. The piercing wail of a siren cut through the air, growing closer and closer until a police cruiser flew around the corner and slid to a stop in front of my house. Then another. They didn't come with their sirens off, they came loud and fast. An officer got out, a large man with a calm, square face. He took one look at me and Leo and his whole posture changed. It wasn't aggressive, it was protective. He put a hand out, gently. "Sir, I'm Officer Miller. Can you tell me what's going on?" His partner was already out of the car, hand on his sidearm, using his vehicle as cover while he scanned the front of my little house. I tried to explain again. The words came out in a jumble. "My son, his friend," he said, "Mr. Smile, was in the wall." I thought it was imaginary, but then I heard him. "There's a hole." Officer Miller didn't look at me like I was crazy. He just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on my face, listening. He spoke into the radio on his shoulder. "We have a possible B&E, possible squatter. Subject may be concealed within the structure. Homeowner and minor child are secure." They had me sit on the curb, a safe distance away. The man from the car had already gone, melting back into the night once the professionals had arrived. Another officer brought a thick wool blanket and wrapped it around Leo, who had finally quieted down to a series of hiccuping sobs, his face buried in my chest. I held him so tight I was afraid I'd hurt him. The quiet street was now a stage, lit by the hypnotic, silent flashing of the emergency lights. More cars arrived. They established a perimeter. They spoke in low, serious voices, using codes I didn't understand. It was all so methodical, so orderly. It was the complete opposite of the chaos I had just escaped. I had to show them. I pointed a trembling finger at the small window of Leo's room. In there, the wall on the left side of the room, near the floor. That's where he is. After a brief conference, 2 officers, armed with a heavy-looking sledgehammer and a pry bar, went to the front door. Another officer stood with me. "We're going to clear the house, sir. Just stay here with your son." I watched them disappear inside. The house was silent for a long moment. Then I heard it, a loud, jarring crash as the sledgehammer met the drywall. Crunch. A pause. Crunch. It was a brutal, destructive sound, but right now, it was the most reassuring sound in the world. They were tearing my house apart to find the monster. After the third swing, there was a shout from inside. It wasn't a shout of alarm, more of surprise. "We've got him. Show me your hands. Show me your hands now." I wanted to see. I desperately needed to see what had been living on the other side of that wall, breathing the same air as my son. I stood up, still holding Leo tightly, and moved closer, stopping at the edge of the lawn. The officer with me put a hand on my shoulder but didn't stop me. They brought him out a few minutes later. It wasn't a monster. It was something worse. It was a man. He was impossibly thin, his skin a pale, unhealthy gray, caked with grime and plaster dust. His hair was a matted, greasy mess, and his clothes were filthy rags. He looked less like a person and more like something that had been grown in the dark, something that hadn't seen the sun in years. He didn't fight. He didn't scream or curse. He just let them cuff him, his body limp, his head hanging down. As they walked him past me towards a cruiser, he lifted his head for a second, and his eyes met mine. They were hollow. There was nothing in them. No anger, no malice, just a strange, vacant confusion, like an animal startled from its burrow. He smelled of sweat, dust, and something else. Something sweet and cloying, like old candy. The immediate danger was over. The physical threat was in the back of a police car. A wave of relief so powerful it made my knees weak washed over me. I sat back down on the grass, pulled the blanket tighter around Leo, and for the first time since he'd uttered that terrifying invitation to dinner, I took a full, deep breath. It was over. We were safe. An EMT checked us both over. We were fine, physically. They gave Leo a little teddy bear, which he clutched with the same desperation he had clutched my shirt. They asked me questions, and I answered them as best I could. They told me the space he'd been living in was a forgotten shaft, a narrow gap between the walls from some old renovation, barely 2 feet wide. He'd been in there for God knows how long. About an hour later, as the dawn was starting to break, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, Officer Miller came over to me. His face wasn't calm anymore. It was tight, grim. "Mr. Davis," he said, his voice low. "We found his nest, for lack of a better word. We found some things you need to see." He led me to the trunk of his cruiser. Inside was a cardboard box they'd taken from the nest. It was filled with a pathetic collection of things. Empty candy wrappers, a half-eaten bag of chips, a couple of small, cheap plastic toys that I recognized as Leo's. He'd been stealing them from the room. But that wasn't what the officer wanted to show me. He reached in and pulled out a small, spiral-bound notebook. It was stained and dirty. "We found this," he said, handing it to me. My hands were shaking as I took it. I opened it to a random page. It was covered in a messy, almost childish scrawl. October 3rd Road, 7:15 a.m. Dad made pancakes. Leo didn't like them. Too dry. 2:40 p.m. Leo drawing. A green dinosaur. He is a good artist. 8 p.m. Dad read him a story about a bear. Dad's back hurts. He should be more careful. I flipped through the pages. It was all there, page after page of meticulous, terrifyingly accurate observations of our lives. What we ate, what we wore, what we said, conversations he could have only heard through the thin plaster of the wall. He had been listening to every single moment since the day we moved in. The comforting bubble of privacy I thought we'd had in our own home had never existed. We'd been living in a terrarium, and he was the one watching through the glass. My stomach turned. I felt sick. This wasn't just some homeless drifter looking for shelter. This was something else. This was an obsession. There's one more thing, Officer Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. He took the notebook from my numb fingers and turned it to the very last page with writing on it. There was only one sentence, scrawled a little bigger than the rest, as if for emphasis. I read it aloud, my own voice sounding thin and distant. Leo is a good boy. He will make a good son. Not like the last one. I looked up at Miller, my mind struggling to process the words. The last one? What does that mean? The family who lived here before us? Officer Miller's face was a stone mask. He avoided my gaze, looking back at the house, now just a crime scene taped off in yellow. We're running the background on the previous tenants right now, he said, his tone professional, but with an undercurrent of something that chilled me to the bone. Sir, the family that lived in this house 5 years ago, they had a little boy. He was 6 years old. He finally looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not just pity but a deep, resonant horror that mirrored my own. He disappeared from his bedroom one night, the officer said. They never found him, not a single trace. The world tilted. The morning air, which had felt so cool and clean just moments before, now felt heavy and suffocating. I looked down at Leo, who was finally asleep in my arms, his face peaceful, the donated teddy bear tucked under his chin. He hadn't just escaped a madman. He hadn't just escaped a kidnapping. I pulled him closer, the fragile warmth of his body a stark contrast to the ice that was flooding my veins. We had escaped an appointment. We had just climbed out of a grave that had been dug years before we even knew it existed.